In this presentation, I'd like to talk about some of the findings associated with a study that we undertook at the Seafarers International Research Centre here at Cardiff University. The study looked at the interaction between seafarers on cargo ships and a variety of shoreside personnel. And today, I'm going to talk about some of the findings which emerged in relation to port personnel. The study was quite comprehensive. On this map, you can see that the pink dots represent ports that we called out on ships where we undertook observations, and the blue dots represent places where researchers went to conduct interviews and questionnaires with seafarers. In total, we did 9 ethnographic voyages visiting ports and a variety of semi-structured interviews on board ships, along with vignette-based interviews in countries such as the UK, India, Philippines, China, Singapore. And we carried out 2,500 interviewer-administered questionnaires in the same places. The 4 areas that I'm going to focus on today relate to seafarers' experiences of different sorts of exchanges in port. And I'm going to talk about facilitation gifts, which generally take the form of cartons of cigarettes, crates of soft drinks and alcoholic beverages. I'm going to talk about the practice of port personnel visiting the ship's storerooms and raiding their provisions. I'm going to talk about financial extortion, which sometimes or usually takes the form of extortion against companies, but sometimes takes the form of extortion against seafarers in person. And finally, I'm going to talk about fraudulent fuel supply, fraudulent bunker supply. The practice of using facilitation gifts is very widespread, very common, and 95% of our deck officers who responded to the questionnaire talked about having experienced giving cigarettes, drinks and so forth to port officials. It's particularly prevalent in ports where the officials are not paid very high salaries and in developing countries, much less common in the European Union, the USA, for example. The vast majority of seafarers, 81%, described how their companies or the charterers tended to pay the cost of cigarettes and drinks. And the consequences of refusing gifts were reported to be very severe, which is why the companies and charterers generally provide the funds for this kind of facilitation gift to be provided to port personnel. The consequences are so severe that they caused seafarers quite a lot of stress because they were always anxious that if they got it wrong, if they negotiated in the wrong way or if they refused to give sufficient gifts, that these consequences would be ones that they had to meet. One seafarer explained to us how on board a ship that he was sailing on, the captain had a policy of not actually giving facilitation gifts. He described how on a particular occasion the captain refused to give them anything, he said. He said that he did not give anything to anyone. As a result of that, the ship was arrested for some supposed serious deficiencies. They were fined more than $100,000 because they supposedly found expired products. The company paid the amount. They had no choice. The ship was blacklisted while everything was being rectified. So sometimes it's much better to give gifts. They are not very expensive. And that generally sums up the view of most seafarers in relation to facilitation gifts. They generally felt that if the company could pay for the disbursement of a few small gifts, that this would avoid a lot of trouble for them in port. They felt very differently about the raiding of provisions, however. When port personnel visited the ship and demanded to go to the storeroom and steal provisions from the cold stores and from the freezers, they felt quite offended. They felt really that this was a violation. And some of them explained their feelings to us as follows. One of them said, "It's not theirs, this is for the crew. In my first visit to Ukraine, I saw how they do it, like they're shopping. They get just what it is that they want." And seafarers felt that this was really insensitive of port personnel, a betrayal of trust, really, because they themselves weren't in a position to go and replenish their stores. Another seafarer said to us, they can buy all these things, but we can't buy, you know. Suppose we're going to Africa, everything is finished, then what are we going to do? We can't do anything, we have to wait for the next port to buy. And that was something that we had actually been told quite a number of times by seafarers, of occasions when they left a port having had their provisions raided, and then the ship was on short rations, sometimes ran out of quite important things. So the 73% of seafarers who directly experienced provisions being taken by shoreside officials from the ship did feel that this was quite a betrayal of trust, and it did undermine the relationships that they had with port-based officials. The third problem that I want to focus on today relates to financial extortion. 69% of seafarers stated that they had actually experienced being on a ship when shoreside officials asked for cash, and 80% of seafarers said that they felt stressed by the prospect of being asked for cash in ports. Occasionally we were also told about situations where seafarers were sort of asked for cash directly from their own pockets. This practice is particularly prevalent in West Africa, but again we see a similar pattern of developing economies being the areas where this was most prevalent, and it being relatively unusual practice in other more developed countries like Japan, the EU and the USA. Unfortunately, the agent who is employed by companies to assist ships and facilitate negotiations and transactions in ports is often seen to be part of the problem when it comes to extortion. And seafarers again experienced this as a betrayal of trust. They felt offended on behalf of the company, and they also felt that they themselves couldn't properly trust the appointed agents. One seafarer explained to us, most of the time the agent is part of this. The company pays the agent about $10,000 to assist us, and then they show that kind of service. Most of the time the agency has something to do with this. This is the ugly truth. The final area that I'd like to focus on relates to the fraudulent supply of fuel to ships. 87% of chief engineers had been on a ship where less fuel had been supplied to the vessel than was claimed by the bunker barge master, the suppliers of the fuel. 93% of chief engineers found that this practice was very stressful. One chief explained to us that you're very, very stressed. It's like having 50 cups of coffee every day, for you have thoughts about how you'll explain it to the company. Why do they have to cheat? Well, it's because the gain is millions. Imagine that those in the bunker barge are wearing Rolex watches. For the barge people, it's easy money. For us, it's so stressful on board. Now, the stress relates to the fact that, on the one hand, fuel is extremely expensive, and so seafarers wish to protect their companies from being cheated. And on the other hand, they were aware that if the shortfall in fuel was too great, that they would be required to get involved in a lot of explanations with their companies. They would be asked to account for how this had happened, and yet it was really something that they found very difficult to control. So this created quite a bit of stress. And a lot of chief engineers explained how today the stress is greater than it was in the past. And this is because the regulatory environment has changed. It's much more difficult for seafarers to keep back supplies of oil to cover up the shortfall. In the past, they used to be able to keep a little fuel in reserve, and then they would adjust their consumption figures in the course of the voyage to make up for the shortfall. A chief engineer explained to us previously the chief engineer could reserve some extra 10 to 20 tonnes to balance the shortage. Now the extra oil reservation is not okay. The pressure on the chief engineer before was not as significant as today. Now, due to the strict pollution control and the oil reading, major pressure is originated from this issue. And it was something that chief engineers found extraordinarily stressful on board. To conclude, what I would like to say emerge from these findings is that these corrupt and unprofessional demands don't just have financial implications for companies. Seafarers find these interactions extremely stressful. Sometimes they feel that they undermine the trust that they can place in port officials, the trust that they can place in the agents that are supposed to be assisting the vessel as well. Such demands and practices, the research showed, are surprisingly commonplace. Facilitation gifts are very common, but the fraudulent bunker supply was astoundingly common practice. And it's clear from our research that such practices are very difficult for companies to defeat using unilateral action. That really the only way to actually defeat these kinds of practices is for companies to work together and to decide on particular practices, perhaps refusing to give any gifts or blacklisting agents, or whatever practice it is that they decide to do. But what is clear is that individual masters and individual ships find it very difficult to resist these practices because the port personnel have huge power to actually take steps against the ship which are very damaging to the ship and the company. Thank you very much.